My pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend, Professor Noel Castree. Noel, as many of you will know, is a Professor of Geography here at the University of Manchester. He received his bachelor's degree from the University of Oxford and a master's and a PhD from the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. After completing his PhD, he took up work at the University of Liverpool and has been at Manchester since 1999. He received the Royal Geographical Society's Gill Memorial Award in 2005, and he's the author of Essential Reading in Political Ecology, Theories of Neoliberalisation, and a range of other topics. His books include Nature, 2005, Social Nature, Theory, Practice and Politics, 2001, and an earlier book from 1998, co-edited with Bruce Braun, Remaking Reality. His latest book is making its way through the presses right now, will hit the shelves in July of this year, Making Sense of Nature. So it is my privilege to invite Noel to speak to us this afternoon. Noel.
Great, thank you very much, Gavin. Hello everybody, good afternoon. Really pleased to have this chance to speak to you, though you may not be so pleased at the end of this when you've heard what I have to say. I don't know how this is going to go. How's your week been so far anyway?
Very good.
Good, is it? Yeah, people are happy?
Productive.
Okay, productive, good. I really hope I can help you maintain that mood. Okay, so you can see my title behind me, and I hope at least some of you have had the chance to read the two epigrams. Let me begin with an apology. I suggested two readings for today that now bear only very small relevance to the content of what I'm going to say in the next 45 minutes or so. What I want to do is present some ideas and arguments that I've been chewing on for a while, but I've not shared with other people before. And I want to suggest to you that certain strands of thinking in environmental political economy are, despite themselves, characterised by an inability to look beyond the horizon of endless capital accumulation. So I'm not going to talk about the neoliberalisation of environmental governance directly, which was the subject of my own and Karen Backer's essays that I think were given to you before this session, in fact before Entitled began. Instead, what I want to do is ask some questions about the content and the likely effects of theories that are ostensibly critical of the socio-ecological impacts of capitalism on a world scale. I want to focus on Marxist contributions because they've been foundational for much of my own thinking and writing since 1990 when I began my graduate studies. Because Maria asked me to talk about theory, you didn't know that, but I obviously do, I'm going to begin there. So, I'm going to begin with some comments about theory, and then the presentation has three parts. I'm going to say something about the way in which Marxists, starting in the 1980s particularly, began to engage with the question of ecology. I'm then going to look at more recent contributions that take seriously the scale of future anticipated climate change. And I'm going to conclude with a question. Is much of this theoretical work in some significant way unpolitical, non-political despite itself? Okay. Right. I hope you can see that cartoon because it's mildly amusing, I think. Okay, so when I was 17, I borrowed the book Social Justice in the City from my college library. And this was before I went to university. When I say college, I don't mean university college. I didn't get very far. The book definitely baffled me. But what I recall vividly was being intrigued and actually quite excited by Harvey's scattered comments on something I'd not thought much about before, namely theory. And then I later discovered that he'd ended his previous book, Explanation in Geography, with a now well-known declaration, by our theories you shall know us. And of course, more than anything else, we know Harvey today because of his theoretical analysis of capitalism's temporal and spatial dynamics. Now, speaking for myself, I think Harvey's own understanding of theory, which I believe has been highly consistent since his turn to Marxism in the early 70s, I think it offers us some essential insights even if you don't consider yourself a historical geographical materialist, as he obviously does. So what I want to do is go through some propositions about theory inspired by Harvey's writings that have influenced the way that I think about theory and may help you too. Okay, so here are the propositions. So first and most obviously, Harvey defines theory in a pretty conventional way. For him, it's a set of interrelated abstractions, what in the limits to capital he called, quote, an elaborated conceptual apparatus intended to grasp the most significant relationships at work within the intricate dynamics of social transformation, end of quote. So to use an observation usually attributed to Claude Levi-Strauss, theory is intended to replace a complexity that we don't understand, the world has experienced, with one that we do, namely the world as represented after systematic inquiry. Okay, that's the first thing. But secondly, Harvey goes far beyond this minimal definition, as many of you will know. Because his object of analysis is capitalism, and because this mode of production's signature characteristic is dynamic instability, then for him, theory needs somehow to represent a world in motion. And that means then that a fitting metaphor for theory is not cartography, the idea of a mental map, but instead choreography. And that's why the Marxist philosopher Bertel Ollman titled one of his books The Dance of the Dialectic. We need, he said, to suffuse theory with the kinesthetics of the world. Okay? That's the second thing. Third, Harvey insists that theory matters because the processes and relations that it makes manifest are actually hidden from view. So they appear as something other than themselves. So in our daily lives we cannot, Harvey's argued for a long time, perceive the forces that produce reality as we experience it. And that's why Louis Althusser, one of the most famous Marxist philosophers of the last 60 years, once talked of the detour of theory. We need, he said, to use the power of abstraction to identify the invisible determinants of stability and change in the commodities we buy, the jobs we seek, the investment opportunities that are offered to us, and so on and so forth. So far from being a kind of purely cerebral pursuit, a luxury of paid academics and intellectuals, Harvey's always argued that theory is and should be a sort of worldly, earthy thing. Now that said, in 1973, when he wrote Social Justice, I'm sure he didn't anticipate how valuable a currency theory would become within the Western university system. And as I think we all know, to be a theorist these days can bring a certain celebrity, not to mention job security and a good salary in universities that are now very aggressively measured and monitored in ways that are fairly unprecedented. And like it or not, of course, Harvey is himself a big theorist, an educator whose appearances become valued events in the curious currency of academia. Okay. Fourth, Harvey has been unapologetic that Marxist theory is necessarily global in ambition. It makes, he says, cognitive and political claims on people living at all points of the compass. And that's because, for him, and for pretty well all Marxists, capitalism is expansionary. It unifies diversity, it conjoins the here and the there, the near and the far. So as Marx and Engels famously declared in the Communist Manifesto, quote, the need for a constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the whole surface of the globe, end of quote. Now, as post-colonial critics have argued, capitalism's universality doesn't exempt analysts from accounting for the blind spots and the exclusions written into their own knowledge claims. So in the words of geographer Derek Gregory, quote, if we're to free ourselves from universalising our own parochialisms, we need to learn how to reach beyond particularities without diminishing the significance of the places and the people to which they are accountable, end of quote. Okay. Fifth, for Harvey, theory takes different forms, Marxist theory being just one of several representations of the world that we collectively inhabit. So in Social Justice, he famously distinguished between counter-revolutionary and revolutionary theory. And he reprised that distinction 12 years later in a very intemperate essay in the journal Society in Space. And for Harvey, the former, that is, counter-revolutionary theory, comprises abstractions that obscure the processes and relations that the latter, revolutionary theory, seeks to reveal. So the battle of theory, then, is just as, perhaps more, important than any other battle that we can think of. And as Harvey said in The Urbanisation of Capital, a book he published in 1985, quote, "The struggle to make Marxian concepts both plain and hegemonic is as important as active engagement on the barricades. That is why Marx wrote Capital, and that is why I can write these words." End of quote. Sixth, it follows for Harvey that theory is both a product of its socio-economic and political context, and yet, in some sense, irreducible to that context. For example, in his 1989 collection, The Urban Experience, he called for more, not less, Marxist theory, because urban studies, in his view, had become fixated on the fine details of metropolitan restructuring in Western countries that had resulted from the economic crises of the 1970s and 80s. And we can, he insisted in the same year, choose the path of a revolutionary theory that exposes the counter-revolutionary impulses in much of the postmodern thinking that was flourishing at that time. Finally, for Harvey, as for Marx, depending on the historical geographical conditions, theory can be a major or minor material force. It is irrelevant, he famously said in Social Justice, to ask whether concepts and categories are true or false. We have to ask rather what produces them and what they serve to produce. End of quote. Now that directs us to the institutions, the agencies and the collectivities that might want, or not want, to actualise the lessons of theory, or, as Bertil Ohlmann has it, dance to its tune, or perhaps compose a new one. But what are these lessons? Well, Harvey has in fact been equivocal here, and it's no real surprise. In Social Justice, he held to a view that rigorous theory would, at any one moment in time, reveal the real potentials of the present, be they large or small. And famously, of course, Marxists have long pinned their hopes for systemic change on leveraging those periodic moments of crisis that are part of capitalism's DNA. However, when the potentials are very minimal, witness the current period, even after the global financial crisis and the mass protests in Greece and elsewhere, when the prospects for change are minimal, does the theorist sigh heavily and hope for better times? Do they retreat to their office and seek refuge in exploring aesthetics, utopias and imagined futures, as some members of the Frankfurt School did in the 1950s or 60s? Or do they do something else? Okay, there's a lot there to digest. Let me then move on. Now, I'm not holding Harvey up as a model, okay? Not at all, but simply as someone useful to refer to when thinking about theory, especially if you consider yourself part of the Marxist tradition. Now, with the observations I've just made in mind, let me now turn to the work of those Marxists who've been centrally concerned with the fate of the non-human world and with how environmental issues affect the project of reforming or dissolving the rule of capital. Now, to my mind, there's no doubt that the question of nature has provoked a lot of theoretical innovation in Marxism over the last 25 years. And a number of authors, as most of you will know, have tried to bring the biophysical world, both materially and as it's represented discursively in everyday life, popular culture and politics, into the heart of Marxist political economy. And among these authors are the Germans Eltmar Altvater and Rainer Grundmann, the Brit Ted Benton, the Americans Paul Burkett, James O'Connor and John Bellamy Foster, the Scot Neil Smith, very sadly deceased last year, and my colleague Eric Swingadow, who you heard from earlier today, and whose writings I will say more about in a little while. Now, in different ways, and I've not got all the pictures up there, but in different ways these authors have showed how nature is either a vehicle for or a barrier to capital accumulation. But not always in a direct biophysical sense, than in the sense that politics intrudes. Environmentalism has become a language of protest that can sometimes arrest capitalist development in its tracks, and we've known that for well over 40 years. Now, such protest, of course, inspired the classic post-Marxist work, or I would call it post-Marxist anyway, The Environmentalism of the Poor by Joan Martinez Allier. Now, it's books like these, by the people that I've mentioned, that fired my imagination and inspired a good deal of my published writing in the early part of my career. And I was particularly taken in the late 1980s and the early 1990s with Neil Smith's concept of the production of nature, and I wondered at that time how it could incorporate the arguments of Altvater, Benton and O'Connor that the non-human world was not a tabula rasa upon which capital could write at will. How could what we call nature be both internal and external to capitalism at the same time? That was one of the questions that I was interested in. And in answer to that question, you can construct complex theoretical answers, and I tried to do that to some degree. Now, with the exception of Bellamy Foster and Eric, who I think have continued to innovate, the major theoretical contributions of the authors that I just mentioned were conceived and published in the 1990s. Now that's significant, I think, because that decade precedes the period when the transnational community of climate scientists began to talk tough about the likely magnitude of future climate change arising from long-run greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, there was the Earth Summit in 1992, but understandably none of the authors whose names I've mentioned took seriously the idea that cumulative greenhouse gas emissions from over 2 centuries of capital accumulation, and particularly the petrocapitalism of the 20th century, could somehow have profound positive feedbacks on a global scale. None of the authors, I think, took that seriously, and that was very understandable. Instead, in a distinctly non-Marxist idiom, it was sociologist Ulrich Beck who, in the Western social science community, pointed most forcefully to the disruptive potential of what he called manufactured risks, like anthropogenic climate change. Okay, compare the situation then and now. With the possible exception of the United States, where large sections of the population, I suspect, remain sceptical about the idea of global warming, the fourth IPCC assessment report of 2007 was arguably a turning point. It was preceded, as you know, by the extremely high-profile Stern Review, and the idea that significant, unplanned and largely uncontrollable environmental change awaits us has, I think, to some extent now become normalised, certainly in large parts of Western Europe, even though some, of course, still question it. And what are the scientists now saying, right now, today? Well, a significant minority have combined evidence of past emissions, projections of likely emissions and physical process laws to suggest that 2 degrees Celsius rise in global mean temperature is now inevitable. In fact, according to Kevin Anderson and Alice Bowes of the Tyndall Centre at this university, 4 degrees C is more likely, even before 2100. Now, for life on Earth, that is, as they say, a game changer. Indeed, after the last-ditch attempt of climate skeptics to discredit the science in 2009-10, I'm referring, of course, to Climate and Glaciergate, as they became known, quite a few climate scientists have come out fighting. So rather than sort of retreat to an apolitical stance of pure fact providers, many have ventured judgments about dangerous climate change, thus taking a leaf out of the pages of conservation biology, one of the more normatively engaged and policy-relevant sciences. So one example of this is, and I'm sure some of you know this work, publications by Johan Rockström and colleagues. This one's called Planetary Boundaries, Exploring the Safe Operating Space for Humanity, and this kind of work's created a bit of a hubbub in the scientific and policy community in the last 18 months. Now, I'm not saying that future climate change is all that we should care about. There are plenty of environmental issues in the here and now that demand urgent attention. And indeed, much of the critical literature on neoliberalism and environmental policy, to which I've contributed, takes issue with how the popular idea that trades and price setting can somehow dispense environmental justice and ecological protection and remediation, have taken issue with that idea in the here and now. But what I'd like to suggest is that taking the considered claims of climate scientists seriously must affect the content and the aim of any serious attempt to theorise the present. So these claims of people like Kevin Anderson and Alice Bowes about the future that very likely awaits us globally, these claims oblige us to connect today and tomorrow in ways that are arguably unprecedented in the history of Marxism, indeed in any body of radical thought with genuine political ambitions. And I say unprecedented because what the climate science is now telling us is that we have to consider how to make a future that's already, in significant measure, programmed to be one of massive, though uneven, shifts in the character of the world's physical geography. Okay. Now, many Marxists publicly acknowledge the predictions of the IPCC and of outspoken climate scientists like Kevin Anderson. So John Bellamy Foster is notable here with his more recent arguments about the ecological or metabolic rift between capitalism and the biophysical world. But what I want to do now is to illustrate how some contemporary Marxist theorists have, not John Bellamy Foster, have tried to integrate the subject of future climate change into their work by looking at three people within my own discipline, Anglophone geography. And one of the reasons I do that is Marxism still enjoys a respected, if small, place in the intellectual ecosystem of geography in the West. Okay, so three contributions, and I want to scrutinise these and try and demonstrate to you the way that they're thinking about the future that may await us. So the first one then is a piece by Dan Buck at the University of Oregon, who's formerly at the University of Oxford. And it's an essay called The Ecological Question, Can Capitalism Prevail? Some of you may have read it, most of you probably haven't. And it appeared in the Socialist Register 2008. It comes out every year. The subtitle of that particular edition of the Register was Coming to Terms with Nature. Okay, so in that book, Dan Buck's essay stood out by projecting ahead to a future of unanticipated environmental change, as well as anticipated socially produced scarcities like the exhaustion of recoverable oil reserves. Most of the other essays were focused on the present, the here and now, but Buck actually looks ahead. Does he foresee a future in which the second contradiction of capitalism, as James O'Connor phrased it, is of sufficient scale and scope to trigger a revolution against capital? No, he does not. He stays faithful to the late Marx's depiction of capitalism, and he makes two related arguments about the future. First, he says, capitalism thrives on creative destruction. It must be in perpetual motion. Change has to be the only constant. Second, and I quote, capital does not care what fleeting forms it assumes, as long as it valorizes and expands itself within socially determined time horizons, end of quote. So in sum, for Buck, the future may be bleak, and capitalism may suffer what Altvater calls time-space decompression, but it's likely to be capitalist nonetheless. That's the future that Buck foresees. And there he is, just in case you wanted a picture. Okay. Right, let me now turn to another contribution, also by an American, educated at Berkeley, like Buck was, Nathan Sayer, in a piece called Climate Change, Scale and Devaluation, The Challenge of Our Built Environment, published in 2010. And again, if you want a picture, he's there on the right. Okay, so Sayer takes future climate change very seriously. So he's not just preoccupied with the present, he's looking ahead. And he focuses on the United States and he asks, how can the economy be decarbonised quickly? And his answer focuses on the built environments of production, circulation and consumption. Now Harvey famously terms these the arteries through which capital flows, them being the products of these self-same flows. But where Harvey famously saw fixed capital as an eventual barrier to accumulation, Nathan Sayer regards the petro-capitalist landscapes of America as serious barriers to decarbonisation. And rightly so. And what he argues is that by 2050, the physical effects of climate change are likely to have devalued these landscapes. Now that being the case, he argues for a massive rerouting of finance capital, both private and public forms of lending and investing, into clean infrastructures. So he argues that only by pooling and strategically deploying the most fluid form of capital, which is money, on a huge scale, can current accumulation paths be ended. So Sayer's argument is normative, where Buck's is diagnostic. Buck sort of offers us a sullen realism. Capitalism will survive even against the odds. Whereas Sayer offers us a sort of hopeful pragmatism. Leverage capitalism's huge power to remake the face of the earth now, he argues, using the capacities of the national state. Okay. Right. Turning now to Eric. So, as you'll have heard earlier, I suspect, and as is evident in a string of publications, Eric has gone beyond the political economy practiced by the likes of Buck and Sayer. And to summarise, he's ventured into the realms of political theory and political analysis. And what he's sought to understand is the idea of how future climate change is made to perform normative work in the present. So his principal interest is in what Gramsci called the relations of definition, rather than in the relations, forces or conditions of production. So he's asked the following question as I interpret it. How, if at all, does the anticipation of massive biophysical change challenge the current capitalist order? And his answer in numerous published essays is that it does not. And what he's argued is that the idea of future climate change as a catastrophe in the making has been used to entrench contemporary capitalism, not question its very existence. So for him, the idea of future climate change is a pacifier that's been used by elites to quell social dissent, to limit the discussion of alternative ways of living, and yet to emphasise the need for immediate action, paradoxically. We can't delay, to wait is irresponsible. So witness the debate about the return of nuclear power, new renewable energy technologies, geoengineering, carbon capture and storage, and the whole panoply of market environmentalist methods, such as payments for ecosystem services. So to quote the climate scientist Mike Hume, this amounts to a concerted effort to represent climate change as, quote, a problem that can be solved rather than an opening to be responded to, end of quote. So the post-political condition, as Eric calls it, following several well-known French philosophers, is a product of elites closing ranks in order to contain the potentially disruptive effects of diverse attempts to determine what future climate change might inspire us to think and do in the here and now. So it amounts to a semiotic solution to a discursive problem, how to contain thinking and stymie the proliferation of wild ideas. And more sinister perhaps, such is the scope of the climate change challenge, Eric suggests that it's a powerful focus for political energies that might otherwise be directed at other things, like homelessness, or poverty, or debt. We're all environmentalists now. So this post-political condition, as he sees it, rests on both fear and a certain complacency. Apocalyptic imaginaries, evident in Hollywood films like The Day After Tomorrow, or less dramatically in Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth, stoke fear, while the technical solutions debated and implemented assure Western publics that everything will be okay in the end. Okay. So, that's my take on Eric. That's certainly his recent writings. Okay, so I began with some telegraphic observations about theory. I then talked briefly about some pioneering theoretical works of eco-Marxism, as it's sometimes called, which largely preceded the current scientific consensus that significant, though spatially uneven, future climate change is unlikely to be the stuff of fiction. It's going to happen. And finally, I've just given you a whistle-stop tour of the writings of three Marxists strongly committed to the theoretical enterprise who try to make the future present to us in different ways. Now, they're not the only authors I could have identified. There were others, but obviously for the sake of time I've had to focus it. So what I'd like to end now is with some observations about the politics of theory in those three recent contributions, the work of Eric, Nathan Sayer and Dan Buck. And by politics of theory I mean both the political content but also the political work performed by these theoretical contributions. And this is going to involve me offering some criticism of Eric's writings. And in a way, it's a pity he's not here. I actually didn't know I was going to say all these things until 1 o'clock yesterday when I started writing all this. I was going to do something else. But we are friends, and just so you know. There's a picture of us grinning like idiots underneath a statue of Marx and Engels in Russia. 4 years ago, all the cliches come out there. Okay. Right, so let me give the punchline away very early. So here's the punchline. And I would qualify this if I had much more time. So the punchline is going to be that despite their ostensibly critical character, The writings of Dan Buck, Nathan Sayer and Eric on capitalism and future climate change actually serve to depoliticise the two things. Okay, so that's what I'm going to venture. And that's especially ironic in Eric's case for the obvious reason that he sees himself as a diagnostician of depoliticisation. So the question then arises, and I will try and flesh this out in a second, but the question then arises, do theorists simply hold up a mirror to the world, or do they, in the process, actively sustain the things they profess to want to change? Now, in a statement that could have been written by a Marxist, Bruno Latour suggests that, quote, the critic is not the one who debunks and reveals, but the one who assembles. In other words, for Latour, critics should be builders as much as excavators, or what Harvey once called insurgent architects. So I'll just leave you with that now as I try to evidence this claim about depoliticisation. Let me say immediately that politicisation and depoliticisation are of course relative terms. There is obviously no fixed location that we can occupy to define them once and for all. So how do I use them? Well, I use them here to refer to a failure to identify arguments, agents or real potentialities contained in the present that might eventually spark some significant and above all novel anticipatory response to a biophysical future most of us cannot yet experience with our ordinary senses. That's what I'm trying to get at. Can't get much more specific than that, but anyway. Okay, so let me try and evidence this claim then that there's a depoliticisation at work here, despite an apparent attempt to be political. Okay, so in Dan Buck's account then of the global future, what we hear about is next to nothing about anti-capitalist movements, the mass uprisings, the scarcity of resources, the slow or possibly rapid dissolution of community and cooperation, or indeed the new solidarities that might be attendant upon future climate change. We don't hear about any of those things. We learn nothing either about present-day possibilities for step changes in mitigation and adaptation measures, en route to something less fantastical than a greenwashed neoliberalism. Instead, we learn about the future intransigence of capitalism, even after present-day geographies of resources, trade and settlement are long gone. So in Buck's account, politics gives way to the grinding compulsions of economy in the name of a sort of tough-minded realism. In Nathan Sayer, by contrast, politics is the explicit focus, or is an explicit focus. He wishes to regulate capitalism in a Green New Deal kind of a way. Now, compared to where the American economy and society currently is, in a political ecological sense, such a deal is almost revolutionary, and I don't want to underestimate that. It's a really powerful idea. But, just like Dan Buck, what Sayer presumes is that capitalism is the only game in town, and he wants us, in effect, to save it from itself, using the established institutions of private property, markets, and sort of high-minded state institutions. Eric. Now, Eric, of course, makes politics his almost exclusive concern in his recent writings. As I said before, the depoliticisation of climate change is said by him to secure social order while ensuring the continued reproduction of a slightly greened capitalism led by the G8, the BRICS, the World Bank and so on. But by defining the properly political in such strict yet abstract terms, arguably Eric mimics that which he analyses. So in geographer James McCarthy's words, I'm quoting, the post-political risks being analytically flat and totalising. And he continues, and I quote again, I think it's a mistake to insist that political projects must meet a certain relatively narrow set of criteria in order to be judged properly political by a set of very specifically and partially situated observers and theorists. End of quote. Okay. So in Buck then, no politics to speak of. In Sayer, a hopeful politics of state-led reform in which large financial institutions play a leading role. And in Eric's writings, a politics of no politics writ large. Now this is rather depressing. And the political effects of these arguments, if we are seduced by their clarity, feed either pessimism or, I think, very limited senses of what alternative futures climate change invites us to make. There is also, I think, the risk of not taking the scale of future climate change seriously enough. So as Eric has written, for many people the catastrophe is already here. The one ahead of us is perhaps too far away to be meaningful or even believable. And there's also little sense in some of these arguments of the likely profound environmental opportunities and social opportunities of climate change. So there's not a sense that it's actually an opening in Mike Hume's sense. And Hume has a very nice way of phrasing this. He says, let's think about what climate change, not what we should do about climate change, but what climate change can do for us. So if this were 1973 and Harvey were writing social justice, he might actually call the work of Dan Buck, Nathan Sayer, and even Eric's recent writings status quo theory. Because while these theoretical contributions do shed light on important aspects of our current reality, they find in the world little reason to think and act outside the proverbial box. Right. So now let me conclude with some speculations about why theory in this or weekly political register is being conducted. And these are no more than speculations, okay? And by the way, all of this applies to me. I'm not exempting myself from any aspect of this analysis. So first, academic life has become ever more professionalised. And theory is a pursuit, for that reason, that's often divorced from a close understanding of, let alone engagement with, the plans and values of reformist or more radical movements outside the university itself. So, scholars are very adept at speaking to each other, but for all sorts of reasons, less willing or able to shape wider currents of thought or action, and that surely conditions the way that they think and write about the world. Secondly, analysts need to situate themselves historically as well as institutionally. As I'm sure you would agree, a great many Western theorists are, like the societies they analyse, habituated to social stability and also to the blandishments of 21st century capitalism. So the question arises, how well then can we identify current or envisage new alternatives when we are products of the societies we're trying to change? Third, I think many left academics have become accustomed to a certain scepticism about the claims of biophysical scientists. So science and technology studies, or what's sometimes called SSK, made many of us see science as in large measure a social enterprise. And so perhaps then many of us in our bones don't really believe in a future so changed beyond our collective control that we need urgently to take some sort of control right now. And finally, even if we do now believe in such urgency, the geographer Jeff Mann, who's at Simon Fraser University, has made an interesting, if rather glum, suggestion. Now, in a recent piece in the journal Capitalism, Nature, Socialism, he reflects on the need to politicise climate change and to democratise decision-making about the big issues. But in this piece, he makes a personal confession. Now, Jeff Mann is a very talented Marxist theorist, I think, and is one of a younger generation, so much younger than the likes of David Harvey and Neil Smith, but he has a guilty secret that he confesses to in this piece. And the secret is this, that he has a fear that you may need elite control, this is looking ahead to the future, to avoid social breakdown and disorder. And he worries that the properly political, if you permit it to happen, should that even be conceivable and engineerable, will degenerate if extended too far into citizen consultation. So given that, he argues, it's easier to pretend we are now post-political than to commit to an anti-capitalist politics that might need to be much less democratic than it really wants to be. Okay. So, I think rather than summarise what I've tried to do, because hopefully it was relatively clear, it is rather fast and compressed. I'm just going to leave it there.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much indeed, Noel. Thank you. Geographical Society's Gill Memorial Award in 2005, and he's the author of essential reading in political ecology, theories of neoliberalisation, and a range of other topics. His books include Nature, 2005, Social Nature, Theory, Practice and Politics, 2001, and an earlier book, 1998, co-edited with Bruce Braun, Remaking Reality. His latest book is making its way through the presses right now. Will hit the shelves in July of this year, Making Sense of Nature. So it is my privilege to invite Noel to speak to us this afternoon. Noel.
Great, thank you very much, Kevin. Hello everybody, good afternoon. Really pleased to have this chance to speak to you, though you may not be so pleased at the end of this when you've heard what I have to say. I don't
It's my pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend, Professor Noel Castree. Noel, as many of you will know, is a Professor of Geography here at the University of Manchester. He received his bachelor's degree from the University of Oxford and a master's and a PhD from the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. After completing his PhD, he took up work at the University of Liverpool and has been at Manchester for since 1999. He received the Royal...
how this is going to go. How's your week been so far anyway?
Very good.
Good? Is it? Yeah, people are happy?
Productive.
Okay, productive, good. I really hope I can help you maintain that mood. Okay, so you can see my title behind me, and I hope at least some of you have had the chance to read the two epigrams. Let me begin with an apology. I suggested two readings for today that now bear only very small relevance to the content of what I'm going to say in the next 45 minutes or so. What I want to do is present some ideas and arguments that I've been chewing on for a while, but I've not shared with other people before. And I want to suggest to you that certain strands of thinking in environmental political economy are, despite themselves, characterised by an inability to look beyond the horizon of endless capital accumulation. I'm going to say something about the way in which Marxists, starting in the 1980s particularly, began to engage with the question of ecology. And they're going to look at more recent contributions that take seriously the scale of future anticipated climate change. And I'm going to conclude with a question. Is much of this theoretical work in some significant way unpolitical, non-political despite itself? Okay. Right. I hope you can see that cartoon because it's mildly amusing, I think. Okay, so when I was 17, I borrowed the book Social Justice in the City from my college library. And this was before I went to university. When I say college, I don't mean you. So I'm not going to talk about the neoliberalisation of environmental governance directly, which was the subject of my own and Karen Backer's essays that I think were given to you before this session, and in fact before Entitled began. Instead, what I want to do is ask some questions about the content and the likely effects of theories that are ostensibly critical of the socio-ecological impacts of capitalism on a world scale. I want to focus on Marx's contributions because they've been foundational for much of my own thinking and writing since 1990 when I began my graduate studies. Because Maria asked me to talk about theory, you didn't know that, but I obviously do, I'm going to begin there. So, I'm going to begin with some comments about theory, and then the presentation has three parts.